Brian Thompson, Luigi Mangione. You might know the names, but what do you really know about them? Victim Brian Thompson was characterised in some quarters as an uncaring health insurance boss. Luigi Mangione is considered by some to be a folk hero. Does the truth fit the memes? If not, why doesn't the internet seem to care? I'm Jordan Dunbar. This is the Mangione Trial podcast from the BBC World Service. Our podcast looks at the unprecedented reaction to the killing of Brian Thompson, who was shot dead in the US city of New York. Luigi Mangione was charged with his murder and his face went viral. He denies the charges. In these episodes, we take a step back to unpick the conspiracies, consider the facts, and explain what happens in court. To look into the backgrounds of each of these men and find out more about how these narratives have formed, I'm joined by Julie Scharper from the Baltimore Banner online newspaper and the BBC's Mike Wendling from Chicago. We'll be talking in detail about the alleged killer in a moment, but I want to start with the victim, Brian Thompson. Mike, what was the narrative that grew up around Brian Thompson after the shooting?
Well, of course, initially there was shock at the manner of his killing, where it happened, the circumstances. But then there was this, I suppose, parallel narrative that grew up, which was pretty much surprising to many people. A lack of sympathy or even a celebration of his death. The idea of a healthcare CEO makes a pretty easy villain in U.S. society. And there was this image that was painted of him as almost a cartoonish villain, greedy, cold. He became really a symbol of the entire U.S. healthcare industry in some quarters. And, we saw a parallel celebration of the suspect in the case.
So why do you think that, you mentioned it was surprising, why do you think that narrative came up? Just because of his job?
It was in some ways surprising to people who may be looking from the outside, but in other ways it wasn't surprising at all. And I say this because there is an immense amount of anger at the healthcare system. Lots of people, even quite well-off middle-class people, feel powerlessness and anger at the system of private insurance. And I have to say that it's been going on for quite some time, decades. And Brian Thompson's death, his murder, appears to have resonated with a lot of people because of that.
Well, we have done an entire episode that you can find about how the US healthcare system works from the point of view of patients and insurance companies. Mike, tell me, how different was Brian Thompson's actual life from the narrative?
Yeah, I think, for a cartoonish villain, Brian Thompson is maybe doesn't really quite fit the figure here. I'm sitting here and talking to you from Chicago. It's right in the Midwest. And Brian Thompson grew up in kind of a Midwestern town, a tiny town in Iowa called Jewell. Only about 1,000 people. So not a place where you expect captains of industry or CEOs to come from. He grew up on a farm. And from the accounts that I've read, he was a very nice kid. He was top of his high school class. He was an athlete. He was a homecoming king. He went to university in Iowa. He didn't go off to, some elite East Coast Ivy League school. By all accounts, he was smart and popular, and his friends thought that he was a down-to-earth person. He loved to ride snowmobiles and play golf and go fishing, which, if you're familiar with Iowa, those are kind of a few of the primary recreational activities to do. In addition, his company, UnitedHealthcare, is based in Minneapolis, a suburb of Minneapolis called Minnetonka. And, while Minneapolis is a sizable city, in business terms, it's just not New York or even a Chicago. It's a place where he was probably going around without much security, probably living a fairly anonymous life. I'm sure probably known locally, but not well beyond that. He wasn't really a known executive. If you go into a Tesla dealership, you know that Elon Musk owns Tesla. He's been very politicized at protests and whatnot against the U.S. government and the Republican Party here in the U.S. you see signs, criticizing Elon Musk. Healthcare executives and Brian Thompson, it's just not like that. Even the people who are regularly out protesting the healthcare system don't necessarily personalize it to such a degree. They will talk about the company, they will talk about the system, they will talk about politicians, generally not CEOs.
Mike, what did Brian Thompson's parents do? Did they have jobs, really high up in industry? What were they like?
Well, he grew up on a farm. And they were very sort of, humble middle-class people. There was, it's hard to sort of understate the fact that he had such a very normal, typical American background. Pretty much, until this murder, he would have been a very unknown figure.
So it sounds like, coming from a small town in the middle of America, the Midwest, like you say, he's grew up on a farm. He's done exceptionally well to then be head of UnitedHealthcare, one of the biggest companies, fourth biggest company in America, one of the biggest in the world. Give me some idea of how well that company had done and how well Brian Thompson had done at running it.
Well, Brian Thompson, again, sort of rose to the ranks at the company. And in his tenure, profits have gone up substantially. Obviously, whether you think that's a good thing probably depends on whether you're a shareholder, a stakeholder, or the opponents of the company and the healthcare system say that actually they've done it because they are denying more people coverage. Now, that is debatable. Just to give you some statistics, during his time as chief executive, the company's profits went from $12 billion to $16 billion. I mean, huge sums of money.
But Mike, his business success hasn't come without controversy, has it?
So Brian Thompson had been facing insider trading allegations. There was a class action lawsuit filed in May of last year that alleged that he sold $15 million of stock, despite knowing that the company was facing an investigation by the Justice Department for antitrust violations. This lawsuit was filed by a pension fund, the City of Hollywood Firefighters Pension Fund. That's because pension funds in the U.S. and elsewhere particularly put a lot of their money in stock. And so they're the ones who sort of initiated this complaint against Brian Thompson, against other UnitedHealthcare executives as well, saying that they failed to tell investors about this investigation. Now, despite Brian Thompson's murder, that lawsuit remains active. The company has asked for it to be dismissed. They say that its executives, including Brian Thompson, didn't make any false statements.
The anger that you talked about against, by some people, the US healthcare system, putting that on the CEO, Brian Thompson, of a health insurance group, I mean, how realistic is that? Because surely he's head of this massive company. Decisions aren't made by him. Can you talk me through that?
You're right. When it comes to individual decisions, those are people within the company, perhaps, or, even these days, perhaps a computer algorithm that is making some of these decisions. I find it very interesting that people who have been following this in great detail in terms of being, either sort of researchers or activists in the healthcare space, they tend not to personalize things so much, If you were to go to a protest outside UnitedHealthcare headquarters, of which there were several in the months before Brian Thompson's death, you wouldn't necessarily see his name on placards. You wouldn't see individual executives being picked out as sort of being evil or embodying some sort of cruel industry, right? You would see a lot of stuff that would be targeting the company itself and the system. But really, it's only in death that Brian Thompson has become a figurehead for the company or, has gained any widespread name recognition at all.
You've spoken to some of those healthcare reform activists, haven't you? What have they said around the reaction to this shooting?
I spoke to people from one group in particular called People's Action, based here in Chicago. And, their initial response was to express condolences to Brian Thompson and his family. I think the people who are uh, most involved in activism around the healthcare system realize, and they're kind of treading a fine line, certainly not condoning this at all, certainly not wanting to look to capitalize on it. On the other hand, it has brought up some of these issues that are now in the public sphere and being talked about more.
Mike, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We wanted to speak with someone who'd worked closely with Brian Thompson. In his first broadcast interview is Steve Parente. Steve told us how he and Brian met.
We worked together actually in the very beginning of the pandemic. At the time, I was on loan from the University of Minnesota to the White House, actually, working on what became known as the Provider Relief Fund. It was a way to get money to hospitals when they didn't have any money. So unlike, say, hospitals and, say, the NHS, where everything's sort of central budget model, most hospitals get all their money from the private sector, even from public insurance programs like Medicare. And when the pandemic occurred with the lockdowns, all that revenue shut down exactly at the wrong time. And we needed to find a novel way to get that money. And Brian Thompson at United provided that novel way. That's how we met. He was kind, thoughtful, very clever, and just wouldn't accept, when we had challenges, we would think of a novel way to sort of work the problem and work it through. It was wonderful. In a sense, that level of tenacity, creativity, and actually just sort of energy was signature Brian that we found throughout that whole process. Of all the people to do this to, this was the wrong person. And people have this feeling that, insurance companies are evil and that they don't care. Brian was the exact opposite of that. He was probably just the right person at the right time to literally keep tens of thousands of people probably alive, just to make sure that the money kept flowing for those institutions. It's the making of a true hero, a true patriot.
Steve told us how he first found out about the killing.
Well, when I first read it, I actually read just the news briefing that a CEO of UnitedHealthcare was shot, and I've worked with the firm for actually 30 years. And then when I saw it was Brian, I was just beside myself with I couldn't imagine it. He was just a wonderful human being, and I think the one thing that stuck in my mind, realizing with his kids, is just when you read all these stories, it's just like there needs to be someone that says, like, this guy saved a lot of people and did an amazing thing.
Steve Parente there. That's the victim, Brian Thompson. But what about the alleged killer, Luigi Mangione? What do we know about him? Mangione denies involvement in the murder, but the stories around him and his background have only grown in popularity, and that's what we're going to look at now. When Brian Thompson was killed, there very quickly became a narrative of a folk hero committing the crime. Once Luigi Mangione's photograph was released, that really seemed to take hold in some places. Julie Scharper is with us. She's a journalist from the Baltimore Banner and has been working on this story. Julie, you're a Baltimore local. That's Luigi Mangione's hometown. Tell us what we know about his background and his upbringing.
I think it was quite surprising to folks in the Baltimore area when we learned the identity of the person accused in Brian Thompson's killing. He grew up in a very prestigious family here in the Baltimore area. The Mangiones own country clubs. They own real estate, commercial real estate. They have a radio station. They own a small chain of nursing homes. So he really was from this large, close, highly regarded family here in the Baltimore area. And Luigi Mangione himself was an exceptional member of an exceptional family. He grew up in suburban Baltimore in the Towson area. Well off. I've seen the house he grew up in. it's very nice, but you wouldn't necessarily know the immense wealth that the family comes from. Looking at his home, he attended the Gilman School, which is one of the most prestigious all boys private schools in the Baltimore area. The tuition, I think, it hovers around $40,000 a year. And he was a standout student there. He was really interested in robotics. So he was a member of the robotics team. He was interested in artificial intelligence. Friends described him as being very popular and well-liked, a leader among his peers. But not like a nerdy kid at all, despite all those interests in robotics and whatnot. Really sort of well-liked, very handsome. And he was the valedictorian of his class, or the top student of his class, which is a particular honor considering how prestigious the Gilman School was.
So, I mean, he seems to be a top student and he's well-liked.
Absolutely, yes. He was the youngest of three children. He has two older sisters. And I think there's just every indication that he was sort of a golden boy. After Gilman, he went to the University of Pennsylvania, and he was in a program there to complete both a bachelor's and a master's degree in engineering. His focus was computer science and mathematics. He also did very well there and graduated in 4 years with both a bachelor's and the master's, which is quite an accomplishment, especially because COVID happened during that period.
While he was at the university, have his friends said anything about that time? It's a really important time in your life. He's away from home. Do we know what type of student he was in terms of socially?
Well, he did belong to a fraternity at UPenn. And I should say for listeners that UPenn is an Ivy League school.
So that's
very
one of the top ones in America?
Yes, very, very rigorous academics.
We should explain fraternities and sororities in America. They're like societies that students join with other students. They're kind of social societies, is that right?
Yes, for the most part. In some cases, it's more of a professional networking type of group, but primarily and in most circumstances, most fraternities and sororities in the United States are social organizations that involve a lot of partying and a lot of drinking. And he did belong to a fraternity there. And he wrote in one of his posts about his health that he was dealing with some brain fog already, which he ascribed to having Lyme disease from a tick bite.
So, Julie, this is all from a Reddit account that we think belongs to Luigi Mangione. Obviously, we can't 100% verify that. It's worth saying a lot of the detail we have about Luigi Mangione is from social accounts of one sort dating back for many years. We've asked his lawyers to confirm the accounts he had, but they haven't got back to us yet. We'll let you know if they do.
Yes, a lot of what we know about his health comes from posts that he put on Reddit and other online platforms. He talked a lot about his health struggles in some of those platforms while he was at the University of Pennsylvania. And he wrote that it was hard for him to kind of deal with the heavy drinking that was part of fraternity life, because while his peers could bounce back from these nights of heavy drinking pretty quickly, as 18 and 19-year-olds do, for him, he felt like it sort of put him in a health spiral for days afterwards, made it a little more challenging.
So he's well liked. He's the top student of this top private school. He goes to a great university where it sounds like he has a great academic time, but then he starts struggling, according to these Reddit posts, with some health problems. What happens after that? Because on paper, it sounds like he's got, apart from the health troubles, pretty great life.
Well, and right after college, it seems fantastic as well. He moves to Hawaii. He takes a job with a company called TrueCar, doing software engineering, computer stuff. And so he's living in Hawaii. He lives in this sort of intentional community for other digital nomads, people who work in tech and are working remotely. And you look at the photos from this time period, and he just looks like a beautiful person among beautiful people. He's very handsome. He's very fit. You see these pictures of him hiking in Hawaii, and he's got like the perfect six pack and hanging out on the beach. It looks like the cast of a reality show. They all look like mostly people in their 20s that are just living the dream. But I think at that time period, he also was beginning to really deal with some serious back troubles. So a friend of his named R.J. Martin, he was the one that managed this community where Mangione was living in Hawaii. It was called Surf Break. So R.J. Martin was Luigi Mangione's landlord, and also described himself as a personal friend. And so he talked quite a bit about the struggles that Mangione was having with back pain in this time. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce the condition because it's a quite long name, but folks call it, even doctors call it spondy, and it involves the disc sort of collapsing in the lower back, and it's quite painful. If you look at Mangione's platform page on X or Twitter, his background photo, one is him hiking in Hawaii, and on the other side is a picture of a spine with 4 screws in it, which was likely a photo of his own surgery that he had. So R.J. Martin, this friend from Hawaii, described him as having a lot of debilitating back pain. He said that Mangione went surfing in Hawaii and then had a bad, I don't know if it was a fresh injury or if it just sort of exacerbated his existing back problems. But he was bedridden for a period of time after going surfing.
But at this point, we go from having a life like a reality show, beautiful people in a co-living space in paradise, to then Mangione apparently telling people about this terrible back pain. What was his relationship like with his parents at this point?
We don't know a lot about that. The Mangione family has not spoken to the media at all. I think the closest really that we've come is a statement that was put out by the family, very, very sort of generic type statement, as one would expect, expressing concern for Brian Thompson's family and, surprise and shock at the allegations. Luigi Mangione's cousin, he comes from a large family, so he has many cousins, but one of his cousins is actually a state representative here in Maryland. His name is Delegate Nino Mangione. He also issued a statement, but again, rather vague and sort of saying the types of things that you might expect. We don't know a ton about what was going on with his family.
Julie, what about his friends? Because you've reported in the Baltimore Banner about a friend who was trying really hard to get in contact with him last year.
We know that there was a friend who was sending tweets to Mangione through the summer of 2024, asking him if he was going to attend his wedding. It sounds like this old friend was getting married and he had invited Mangione and hadn't received a response and was trying to figure out what was going on. We also know that his mother filed a missing persons report in San Francisco in November. The company where Mangione had been working, which is called TrueCar, was headquartered in San Francisco. So we imagine that that's why his mother went there. But we don't know a lot of details about how much communication they were in.
Julie, tell me, what have Mangione's other friends said about him? He was traveling a lot, wasn't he?
He was in Japan, where he met with a professional poker player named Obara Jun. And Jun talks about meeting him in a restaurant and treated him to a meal and drinks. That he came in by himself. He said he was on vacation, and we ate together for about 30 minutes before parting ways. Also around that time, Mangione was posting on X his thoughts about Japan, and he posted sort of a screed about the country's falling birth rate with his own recommendations for how Japan could change that. He said that the country needs to encourage natural human interaction, sex, physical fitness, and spirituality. Also around that time, he was messaging with a man named Gurwinder Bhogal, who runs a Substack about the social impact of technology. And so Bhogal has written a bit about his interactions with Mangione. He described himself as being very surprised at hearing the allegations because he felt like he had a good relationship with Mangione. He wrote that, "I hope there's been some kind of mix-up because this doesn't seem like him at all." But Mangione was also communicating with Bhogal about Japan and about his impressions of Japan. He described the people there as being like non-playing characters in a video game.
And according to various media reports, there's a book review account that seemingly belonged to Mangione, where he's reviewed hundreds of books, from back pain to more contentious ones.
He reviewed the Unabomber's manifesto, Ted Kaczynski. So the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, was active between the late 70s and the mid 90s. He was a domestic terrorist. He sent package bombs. It killed 3 people with these bombs and injured others, and really had sort of a reign of terror. And he was anti-technology. He was looking for people to return sort of to a primitive way of life. So he talks about the Unabomber manifesto, and he writes, "It's easy to write this off as a manifesto of a lunatic, to avoid facing some of the uncomfortable problems it identifies." But he also described the manifesto as prescient about the ills of modern society.
Julie, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Jordan.
Mangione's lawyers have revealed he's been sent thousands of letters, but is only receiving 10 to 15 a day because of the sheer volume coming in. The website run by his lawyers says they are still often weeks or months late, however, due to the high volume of mail from around the country and world. They've released a photo showing how Mangione has been cataloguing these letters to assure the writers that he has received them. We'll be looking at who is behind that support for Luigi Mangione around the world and what motivates them. That's it from this episode of the Mangione Trial podcast from the BBC World Service. Thank you for watching. Make sure you subscribe to the World Service YouTube channel so you never miss a thing. And if you've heard of a claim you want us to fact check or a question for us to tackle, email us at themangionetrial@bbc.co.uk or WhatsApp us. Just scan this QR code.